the most sort of evocative and the most sort of startling of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's listing the people that Jesus appears to, is this casual mention to the fact that Jesus appeared to 500 people, to more than 500 people, or as above 500 people,
Yeah.
and is never mentioned again. A lot of people use this as an apologetical tool. 500 people saw the risen Jesus, and Paul specifies that some of them are still alive, so presumably they could go and be interrogated. This is clear evidence of a. You don't get mass hallucinations of that kind. We talk about grief-induced hallucinations, but 500 people seeing Jesus all at one time. What's going on there?
So I don't think we know what's going on there. And I have friends who are evangelicals or friends in the apologetical community, and they don't like at all what I have to say about this. But I can't infer anything from a passing reference to an event I know nothing about. So I don't know who these 500 people were. I don't know why they were gathered. Why were they gathered together in the first place? Had somebody, hyped the crowd up and got them going? I don't know. How did this work? Was Jesus in the clouds? Uh, did Jesus, stand there and everybody came by and shook his hand? Could everybody see him up close? How many of these people knew him well or knew him at all? Where did this take place? When did it take place? We don't have any answers to these questions. And what you can do when you're addressing this argument is you can simply say, hey, Roman Catholic literature says that Mother Mary appeared at Zaytun, Egypt in 1968, and she was seen by hundreds of thousands of people. So if that's all you had, would you say, well, obviously it's true? No, you would say, this is weird. Let's find out what it's all about. And if you investigate Zaytun, I don't think it's mass hallucination. I personally think it's a something we know not what. I think it's a very weird event. But the Protestant who doesn't want this to be Mary isn't going to be persuaded by a simple sentence, this crowd repeatedly saw Jesus. So how does it work with the 500 in Paul? I just don't think it works. And of course, there are other events that you can find in Roman Catholic literature where they will say, "Oh, everybody at Fatima saw such and such." Right? They saw the miracle of the sun dance, and it must be God. Well, just a sentence doesn't do anything. You have to investigate what the heck was Fatima, what was it all about, and so on. But the point here is that there are multitude claims about collective appearances, and if you don't belong inside the group that is sponsoring this appearance, you don't say, "Oh, obviously this is true because multiple people saw it." You say, "No, what is this? Let's think about it." And when we try to think about the appearance to the 500, I don't have any data. Now, it might it it might have been really interesting. If I were there, maybe I would say, "Whoa, what the heck is this?" Or, "That's really Jesus." But I don't know. I don't know what happened. How do you picture this concretely? A bunch of people in circles around a guy on a mountain, or what is this? I just have no idea what it is. And I think other people are bluffing when they tell us they know what it is. Um, Sometimes they'll say, well, Paul knew some of these people. Okay, fine. What does that mean? I know people who were at Zaytun, Egypt, right? I've read tons of firsthand accounts by these people. That doesn't show anything. If I were, let's say, a Coptic Orthodox Christian, an Egyptian Christian, I probably would look at this and say, yeah, this is Mary. But since I don't belong to that community, I look at this and say, that's very strange. I don't
Hmm.
know what this is all about. So why, know, we we should be even-handed. If we're not going to, as Protestant apologists, if we're not going to look at one-line claims about Mary and say, "Oh, that means Mary appeared. How can we look at a one-line claim in Paul? I don't get this one.
You mentioned briefly this this interesting subtext that the word for more than, I mean, it says that he appeared to more than 500 people. The word more than, which in Greek is something like epano, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, can mean above, in the sense of, like, when put before a number, it means, like, above 500, more than 500,
Yeah,
above 500 people. But there is this sort of implicit undertone that it could also mean something like above 500, as in some kind of vision in the sky.
yeah.
I thought that was really interesting too. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and a lot of Greek speakers in particular tell me, like, that is interesting, but it's almost certainly being used in the other way. But I just wanted sort of how much stock you place in that consideration.
So I just raised it as a possibility. I didn't regard it as the most likely reading, but there are a couple of Greek texts, ancient old Greek texts that do think of it this way. So yeah, of course it's possible, but on the spectrum, I don't think it's more likely than the other option. But it does make you wonder, because I know of Christians who have passed around pictures of Jesus in the clouds, and they thought, yeah, this is really him. You can go on the internet and Google pictures of Jesus in the clouds. And so there are some people who think this. Again, I don't know anything about this crowd. By the way, one of the things we do know from Marian apparitions is that when you have a crowd and you actually interview people very carefully, you will often find that they're not seeing the exact same thing. Or you can have a crowd where most people say, "Oh, that was Mary," but somebody else will say, "Well, I couldn't quite make out a figure there, or I didn't see anything, or it came, in and out of focus." So if you interviewed these 500 people, how do you have any idea that they would all say the exact same thing? Again, I don't understand it. Um, in Matthew 28, Jesus appears to the 11, and Matthew says, "But some doubted." Okay, well, how many of the 500 doubted if some of the 11 had doubts? And by the way, how were they resolved? How long did they last? And so we don't have any idea. But Paul doesn't say Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't say Jesus appeared to the 12, but some doubted. He just says Jesus appeared to the 12. But Matthew says some doubted. So Paul says Jesus appeared to more than 500. Well, uh, okay.
But to be clear, although it doesn't have the clearly it doesn't have the apologetical weight that a lot of people think it does. However, some people say, oh, well, does that mean that Paul just made it up or something, or was trying to prove a point? I think that you would be equally suspicious of the idea that this isn't grounded in any kind of historical event.
So I don't think that Paul is making this up. This just doesn't fit my idea of Paul. This was some event in my judgment, but again, I just, as a conscientious historian, I don't know how to get a handle on it. So I don't think Paul is making that up.
Hmm.
Uh, but
And crucially,
more than that, I can't tell you.
Paul isn't there, which is an important thing to point out, is that Paul is not one of these witnesses. He's recounting the experience of somebody else, which I think this comes up a lot when we fail to pull apart two important questions. One is, did it happen? And the other is, did the person writing about it think that it happened, whether or not it actually did? That comes up
Yeah.
in a few different areas, I think. But Paul, so we've been talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and this is right at the beginning. Paul lists some of the people that Jesus appears to, and it seems like he's quoting an earlier sort of schema that has been
Yeah.
passed down, although it does end in his own vision, so it's unclear where that starts and ends. But we've kind of gone through two of them. He says that he appeared after rising from the dead, that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12, as you've already mentioned. I've got a couple of questions here. Firstly, isn't Peter one of the 12? So are these two separate occurrences, and why would they be separated out in this way? And secondly, did Jesus appear to the 12? I thought by this point one of them had betrayed him and gone off and hung himself.
Yeah, so I think that the expression "the 12" is just used as the title for a group. So one of the things I observe in my book is that you can refer to there are examples of a number that represents a group, and even as people drop out or join, they still keep the number. So I think 12 just means the circle around Jesus that he selected. I wouldn't do anything with that, although there have been or were in the middle of the 20th century some German scholars who used this to think to argue that, well, the story of Judas betraying Jesus must be a fiction. If Jesus appeared to the 12, Judas must have been among them, and he must have apostatized later. And after he did so, then they wrote him back into the
Right.
pre-Easter period. I think that's convoluted, and I'm just content to say this is the title for a group. Um, so yeah, Matthew is more conscientious. He says the 11,
Hmm.
but there are textual variants which say 12, which show people thought, is perfectly appropriate to speak of the 12 in this connection.
There's also the usage of the 12, possibly including the women that were alongside Jesus. There seem to be instances where the women likely would have been present, and yet they're still referred to as just like the 12, or like a group title. It is a little bit strange as a modern reader to think, well, why would he say the 12 if it was known that there were only 11 of the disciples by then? But this usage does seem sort of crop up every now and again in the Gospels.
Yeah, but so uh, people in antiquity are much less exact with numbers than we are. So we live in a technological society. We grow up with watches and clocks, and when we use numbers, we tend to use them accurately. If you look at the Bible is full of threes and sevens and 40s and way more than should be there. It's just because three means a short period, seven's a little longer, and 40 means, yeah, that's a long period of time. So you fast for 40 days, Noah's flood lasts for 40 days. There were 5,000 people in the wilderness, in Mark 6. Well, nobody counted them. There was no turnstile where they, ran up the numbers and it was exactly 5,000. Uh, so, uh, and you're actually right. My own view is that when Jesus uh, walked around Galilee, he wasn't just followed by 12 guys. I think there's a larger crowd there. I think some of them are women. There must also be tag alongs, people who are interested in him, even though they are not members of the 12. But the gospel writers have no interest in that. That's not the sort of antiquarian interest that they have. There's no theological point to the 12 beyond the 12, but the 12 is really interesting because it stands for Israel and functions in a certain way.